Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Politics and Media Show with me, Salma Yaqub. In tonight's show, we'll be discussing two recently released reports which look at the portrayal and treatment of Muslims in the UK. Firstly, in a report published last month, the organisation Spinwatch, which monitors the media, examined two think tanks, the Policy Exchange and the Centre for Social Cohesion. Their report, The Cold War on British Muslims, argues that these two organisations have downplayed the rise of Islamophobia on the far right and in some cases even condoned the rise of groups such as the English Defence League because of their own links to the so-called counter-jihad movement. To discuss the report by Spinwatch, we have one of its authors, Tom Mills, with us. Tom, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. We're also joined by Professor Mary Hickman of the Institute for the Study of European Transformations at London Metropolitan University. Welcome, Mary.
Hello.
If I can turn to you first, Tom, we do hear about organisations like Policy Exchange, the Centre for Social Cohesion, coming out with their research on a regular basis, pronouncing on the Muslim community. What did you find when you actually examined their organisations?
Well, there's not been much research looking into think tanks, and so we were interested to examine these two examples of think tanks which have been producing research on British Muslims. We did that by looking at their funding networks and their backgrounds and also scrutinising their reports. And we called the report The Cold War on British Muslims because what we found was that these groups had really revised a counter-subversion strategy from the Cold War and were now today applying it to Muslims, inspired by some of the ideological cultural wars of that earlier period. And so that was the theme of the report. So we looked at...
Was that surprising to you? Because these think tanks are quoted often as if they're somehow neutral, unbiased, and therefore what they say is something important and policymakers need to listen to. But from what you're saying, it seems there's quite an ideological slant to them. Is that what you found?
Certainly there's a strong ideological agenda behind both think tanks.
And what would you say that agenda is?
Well, it could broadly be called a neoconservative agenda. The think tanks would generally be appearing in the media referred to as centre-right think tanks. But really what we found was, in terms of the individuals and the political movements which they're representing, they're really quite a small fringe of the right of British politics, which we could call neoconservatism, which is a term that's bandied around a lot. But really, if neoconservatism has a historical root, it was in the anti-communism of the Cold War. And what we find in a lot of the writings of the key figures involved in this think tank, and particularly Michael Gove, who was chairman of Policy Exchange, and the director of the Centre for Social Cohesion, Douglas Murray, is they're quite explicitly in favour of political counter-subversion. And the important thing to understand about this is that what they're trying to do is shift counterterrorism policy away from a focus on public safety, away from security threats, and towards perceived political threats. So a key thing which both of the think tanks have advocated, and this is particularly true of Policy Exchange, is the idea that political violence is rooted in an ideological sort of atmosphere, and that really to deal with political violence, to prevent acts of terrorism, we need to be countering non-violent extremism. So in reality, what this leads to...
It's about making crime or thinking certain things a crime as opposed to actually committing a violent act.
That's right. They see a causal relationship between what they call extremism and acts of political violence. So we can see where this leads is increasing focus on censorship or like portraying certain groups as extremist, even those groups, and they say this explicitly, that don't necessarily present any particular security threat. And what we argue in the report is that the government, the coalition government, seems to have been very much influenced by the strain of thinking. So if you look at their latest prevent strategy, they say quite explicitly that this is something which the Labour government hadn't really put enough focus on in its counter-terrorism policy. But what we argue is that if you get beyond these sort of ideas, you can see that the same arguments were being made in an earlier period. So with anti-communism, There was an idea that there were extremists, and they flourished in a broader sort of political environment. So, in effect, what this means, once you get down to the level of actual policy and beyond the sort of arguments, is increasingly spurious security justifications for monitoring political activism. So, in the earlier period of the 1970s, you had mainstream, even the Labour right, being monitored by MI5. So people like Peter Mandelson or Harriet Harman were being monitored by MI5 in that earlier period.
Well, I'd like to come back and unpack some of that and also turn to Mary. But before I do, I think it's important to point out that Policy Exchange were invited to appear to put their case forward, but they declined. We also invited Douglas Murray from the Centre for Social Cohesion, but he's abroad and unable to make it, and they were unable to send anybody in his place. Mary, could you relate to what Tom is saying there, that there is an ideological war, perhaps you're saying, this Cold War on British Muslims? Is that something that you can relate to, or would you say that Policy Exchange and think tanks like that are actually functioning in a more neutral way?
Well, no, I think the phrase the Cold War is obviously very evocative for many people, not younger generations, but it's a good way of putting it because of the emphasis on an ideological threat. I mean, the notion that because of the ideas you have in your head, you're a threat to society. Now, obviously, people who do, place bombs have had the ideas in their head before, but in a way, just like the rest of the criminal acts, people are only sought, suspected, caught, detained, arrested after the committing of acts. And I think it's been very counterproductive, in a democracy like the United Kingdom, that there's been this emphasis on trying to root out, identify what's called non-violent extremism, which, might, depending on the circumstances, might in another, the word radicalisation, it used to be quite a proud label to have put on one to be a radical, but it's been turned into something that's threatening and makes you, as we try to outline and deal with later, suspect. But I just think that I think the report that Tom's been talking about really is so useful because it's trying to look at where's the push on policymakers coming for framing the discussion about any threat that we now experience in those ways.
Because of course many Muslims watching the programme, would say, yes, they feel that if they have a different political opinion, they're considered worse, more than just traitors. They are threats themselves. You are a terrorist sympathiser. If, for example, you're critical of foreign policy, or you say there may be a political route to why other people may take some kind of extremist action. Do you think this is the main thrust of why they operate in this way, to actually stifle that kind of dissent?
I think that's the key to it, yes. I mean, if you really start to examine what they mean by extremist, are they really talking about acts of violence? Well, it's really, when you get down to it, the key thing, and I think this has been argued by other people, is that it was really only when there was a critique of British foreign policy that the people start to be portrayed as being extremist. And this is used as a sort of catch-all term, anti-Western or anti-British, or, we don't agree with British values and so on. But in reality, it's the people who are highly critical of British foreign policy, people who are seen as politicised, who are seen as a threat. So politics is a contradiction.
On the one hand, it's about our values as part of a democratic society, and yet when people exercise their democratic rights, they are seen as subverting democracy and a threat to democracy.
Certainly, it's contradictory, but this is the nature of the sort of neoconservative ideas, is that they have this sort of invocation of protecting democracy against an external threat. And of course, the end game of it really is you go down a very authoritarian line with this. I mean, rhetorically, of course, it's all about protecting democracy against extremism. But I mean, one of the important things to acknowledge about these reports is that they never really define extremism, what it really is. It tends to be that certain groups are defined as being extremist,